They laughed when she chose the broken shed. They called her the family fool, while everyone else walked away with mansions, cars, and cash. She walked away with dust, rust, and a secret no one could imagine. But in less than 24 hours, those same people would realize they didn't just mock her. They lost everything. The day the Miller family gathered to hear Samuel Miller's will, the atmosphere inside the grand oak-paneled sitting room felt anything but somber. It was supposed to be a moment of reflection, a quiet farewell to a man who had built an empire from nothing, but instead it carried an undercurrent of anticipation, almost excitement. Expensive shoes tapped impatiently against polished floors, subtle glances were exchanged, and faint smiles flickered across faces that should have been grieving. The air itself seemed tense, not with sadness, but with expectation. Grace sat in the far corner of the room, away from the others. She wore a simple black dress, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes still heavy from genuine tears. Unlike the rest of the family, she hadn't come for what she might receive. She had come because she had lost someone who mattered. Over the past 6 months, while everyone else had been too busy with their lives, their careers, and their comforts, she had been the one sitting beside Samuel's bed, holding his hand through the quiet nights, listening to his stories, and offering him the kind of presents that couldn't be bought. Across the room, her brother Richard leaned forward in his chair, barely able to hide his eagerness. His tailored suit and confident posture reflected a man used to winning, a man who believed he was entitled to more. Beside him, Caroline adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, its diamonds catching the light as she checked her phone for the 3rd time in a minute. Around them, the cousins, Marcus, Victoria, and Dennis, shifted in their seats, whispering quietly, their focus already drifting toward numbers, properties, and possibilities. At the center of it all stood the attorney, James Morrison, holding a thick folder that contained the final wishes of the man who had once been the backbone of the family. When he finally cleared his throat, the room fell into a silence that felt rehearsed, like everyone was waiting for their cue in a performance they had already imagined. He began reading, his voice steady and professional, outlining the distribution of Samuel's estate. To Richard went the family mansion along with a substantial amount of money. The reaction was immediate, a satisfied smile, a subtle nod, as if confirming something he had always believed was rightfully his. Caroline received the luxury cars and a beach house, her excitement barely contained as she reached for her phone again, likely already sharing the news. One by one, the others were named, each inheritance aligning perfectly with their expectations, each reaction reinforcing the same truth. They had come not to remember Samuel, but to claim what he left behind. Grace listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She noticed how no one asked about Samuel's final days, how no one mentioned his kindness, his stories, or the life he had lived. It was as if, in that room, he had already been reduced to numbers on a page, his legacy measured only in dollars and deeds. Then the attorney paused. The shift was subtle but noticeable. The tone of his voice changed, and for the first time the room seemed uncertain. He adjusted his glasses and continued, announcing that there was one final provision. Grace looked up, surprised to hear her name at all. She hadn't expected anything, hadn't even considered that she might be included in the will in any meaningful way. Her heart beat a little faster, not out of excitement, but out of curiosity. The attorney explained that Samuel had left her a choice. A choice between a cash payment, $75,000, or the old tool shed located at the far edge of the property, along with the small piece of land it stood on. For a brief moment there was silence. Then the room erupted. Laughter filled the space, sharp and unfiltered. It wasn't just amusement, it was disbelief mixed with mockery. Richard was the first to speak, his voice dripping with condescension as he pointed out how absurd the option was. Caroline joined in, her tone laced with fake sympathy as she described the shed as nothing more than a collapsing structure that should have been torn down years ago. The cousins added their own remarks, turning the moment into entertainment, as if Grace's situation had suddenly become the highlight of the day. Grace felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't respond. She didn't defend herself or argue. Instead, she remained still, her mind drifting back to a quiet moment just days earlier, when Samuel had held her hand and spoken to her in a voice that carried more certainty than weakness. He had told her to choose the shed. He had asked her to trust him. Back in the room, the laughter hadn't stopped. The choice to everyone else was obvious. It wasn't even a real decision in their eyes. Money was tangible, immediate, practical. The shed was useless, a burden at best, an embarrassment at worst. The attorney reminded her that she had to decide immediately, that the terms required her answer without delay. All eyes turned toward her, waiting, some with amusement, others with impatience. Richard leaned back, confident, almost bored, as he encouraged her to take the money. He framed it as advice, but it carried the weight of judgment, implying that anything else would be foolish. Caroline added her own reasoning, pointing out the practical value of cash, reinforcing the idea that the shed held nothing of worth. Grace listened, her fingers gently brushing against the small brass key hidden in her pocket. She could still feel the warmth of Samuel's hand as he had given it to her, the quiet urgency in his voice when he had made her promise to wait. In that moment, the noise around her faded. The laughter, the comments, the expectations, they all blurred into the background. What remained was a simple question, not about money or property, but about trust. She took a breath and made her choice. And with that single decision, everything in that room shifted in a way no one yet understood. The moment Grace said she chose the shed, the room didn't just react, it turned on her. What had started as laughter quickly sharpened into something more cutting, more personal. It wasn't just that they found her decision amusing. It was that they couldn't comprehend it, and what they couldn't understand, they dismissed as foolishness. To them, the choice between immediate cash and a crumbling structure hidden at the edge of the property wasn't a real choice at all. It was obvious, logical, practical. And by refusing that logic, Grace had, in their eyes, confirmed what they had always quietly believed about her. Richard was the first to recover from the initial shock, though his reaction wasn't concern. It was irritation wrapped in mockery. He leaned forward, his expression tightening, as if Grace's decision had somehow inconvenienced him. He questioned her again, not because he wanted to hear her reasoning, but because he expected her to correct herself, to backtrack, to align with what he considered rational behavior. When she didn't, when she repeated her choice with the same quiet certainty, something in his tone shifted. The amusement remained, but now it carried an edge of superiority, as though he had just witnessed proof that he was, indeed, the smarter one. Caroline reacted differently, but no less harshly. Where Richard's response was direct, hers was coded in a kind of polished cruelty. She tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but dripping with condescension, as if speaking to someone who simply didn't know better. She tried to frame the situation as sympathy, as concern, but the underlying message was clear. Grace had made a mistake, and not just any mistake, but one that confirmed she didn't belong in the same category as the rest of them. To Caroline, who valued appearances and perception above almost everything else, Grace's decision was embarrassing, not just for Grace, but for the family as a whole. The cousins didn't hold back at all. Marcus laughed openly, already reaching for his phone, turning the moment into content, something to be shared, consumed, and reacted to. Victoria followed suit, her comments sharper, more pointed, feeding off the energy in the room. Dennis added his own remarks, quieter but no less dismissive. Together, they transformed what should have been a private family moment into a spectacle, reducing Grace's choice to a joke that could be passed around and amplified. Grace stood in the center of it all, absorbing every word, every glance, every subtle shift in tone. It would have been easy to react, to defend herself, to argue, to demand respect, but she didn't. Not because she didn't feel the sting, but because she understood something they didn't. She understood that their reactions weren't really about her choice. They were about their own expectations, their own inability to see value beyond what was obvious. Still, that didn't make it easier. As the room slowly emptied, the laughter lingered, echoing in the spaces between conversations. People moved on quickly, discussing their inheritances, making plans, already envisioning how they would use what they had gained. For them, the moment had passed. For Grace, it was only beginning. Richard approached her before leaving, his earlier mockery now replaced with something colder. There was no humor in his voice now, only authority. He informed her that she would need to leave the mansion by the end of the day, that the house was now his, and that her presence there was no longer appropriate. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The message was clear, reinforced by the way he stood, the way he looked at her, not as a sister, but as someone who had just made herself irrelevant. Caroline added her own remarks, less direct but equally dismissive, suggesting that Grace would be better off focusing on her new property, as if the shed were some kind of consolation prize she had chosen for herself. The cousins didn't say much at that point, but their silence wasn't neutral. It was agreement, a quiet endorsement of everything that had been said. Grace nodded, not because she agreed, but because she saw no point in arguing. There was nothing she could say in that moment that would change their perception. To them, the decision had already been made, and it had already defined her. By late afternoon, she had packed her belongings. It didn't take long. She didn't have much to begin with, and what she did fit easily into her car. As she moved through the mansion, she couldn't help but notice how quickly everything had shifted. The same rooms she had walked through so many times now felt different, not because they had changed, but because the people in them had. When she finally stepped outside, the air felt colder, sharper. She paused for a moment, looking back at the house, at the place that had once held memories of family gatherings, of laughter that had felt genuine, of moments that now seemed distant and almost unreal. On the front porch, Richard and Caroline stood together, glasses in hand, already celebrating. Their posture, their expressions, everything about them reflected satisfaction, as if the outcome of the day had confirmed something they had always believed about themselves. Grace got into her car without saying anything. There was nothing left to say. As she drove away, her phone began to buzz. At first, she ignored it, focusing on the road, on the steady rhythm of the engine, on anything that would keep her grounded. But the messages kept coming, one after another, each one a reminder that the moment hadn't ended. It had simply moved to a different platform. Curiosity eventually got the better of her. At a stop, she picked up her phone and glanced at the screen. The group chat was active, filled with messages that ranged from teasing to outright mockery. Marcus had already posted about her decision, turning it into a story, something to be shared with people who didn't even know her. Victoria had commented on the reactions, counting the likes, the laughs, the engagement as if it were some kind of achievement. Dennis added his own remarks, less visible but still present, reinforcing the narrative that had already taken shape. Then there was a message from Richard. Short, direct, and final. He reminded her that she needed to be completely off the property by morning, that the locks would be changed, that there would be no exceptions. He added, almost as an afterthought, that she shouldn't expect invitations for holidays or family events anymore. The implication was clear. Her choice had consequences, and those consequences extended beyond money. Grace read the message twice, then set the phone down. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel everything, the hurt, the frustration, the disbelief. Not because she regretted her decision, but because she understood what it had cost her. She hadn't just chosen a shed over money. She had chosen something that placed her outside the structure her family had built for themselves. But even in that moment, there was something else beneath the emotion. A quiet certainty. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was there, steady and persistent. It came from the memory of Samuel's voice, from the way he had looked at her, from the trust he had placed in her without explanation. It didn't answer her questions or erase her doubts, but it gave her something to hold on to. As she continued driving, the messages kept coming, but she stopped checking them. The noise, the opinions, the judgments, they were all still there, but they no longer felt as immediate. They were part of a world she had just stepped away from, a world that measured value in ways she no longer felt compelled to accept. Ahead of her, the road stretched out, leading toward a place she had never considered important before. To everyone else, it was just a neglected corner of the property, a forgotten structure with no real purpose. But to her, it was something else now, not because she knew what it contained, but because she had chosen it. And that choice, whether they understood it or not, whether it made sense to anyone else or not, had already begun to change everything by the time Grace reached the far eastern edge of the property. The last traces of daylight had already begun to fade. The road leading there was narrow and uneven, cutting through a stretch of trees that felt deliberately isolating, as if the place itself had been designed to be overlooked. She had driven this path only a few times before, usually as a child, and even then it had never seemed important. Now, with every bump in the road and every shadow stretching across her headlights, the distance between the mansion and this forgotten corner felt symbolic, like she had crossed an invisible boundary between two entirely different worlds. When the shed finally came into view, her first reaction wasn't curiosity or excitement. It was disappointment. The structure looked even worse than she remembered, weathered wood worn down by decades of neglect, a roof that sagged unevenly, and windows so clouded with grime they barely reflected light. Weeds had grown wild around the base, swallowing what little sense of order the place might have once had. For a moment, she simply sat in the car, staring at it, letting the reality of her decision settle in. This was what she had chosen. Not the money, not the safety or comfort that would have come with it. This. A part of her, quiet but persistent, questioned whether her family had been right. Not about her being foolish, but about the value of what stood in front of her. It didn't look like it held anything of worth. It didn't look like something that had been carefully preserved or protected. It looked abandoned, forgotten, and entirely insignificant. But then she reached into her pocket and felt the small brass key. The memory of Samuel's voice returned with surprising clarity. The way he had spoken to her, not with hesitation but with certainty. The way he had asked her to trust him, not explaining why, not giving her details, just leaving her with a choice that required faith rather than logic. That memory was enough to push her forward. She stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin as she walked toward the shed. Up close, the details were even more pronounced: the cracks in the wood, the rust along the hinges, the faint smell of dampness that seemed to cling to the structure itself. It didn't feel like a place where something valuable would be hidden. It felt like a place where things had been left behind. The padlock on the door looked old but sturdy, its surface coated in a thin layer of rust. For a brief moment, she hesitated, holding the key in her hand, aware that whatever waited inside would either confirm her trust or challenge it in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. Then she slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost too easily, followed by a soft click that echoed louder than expected in the quiet surroundings. She pulled the door open, the hinges protesting with a long, drawn-out creak, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of oil and old wood lingering in every corner. Tools were scattered across workbenches, some neatly arranged, others left exactly where they had last been used. It wasn't chaotic, but it wasn't orderly either. It felt lived in, as if someone had spent countless hours there, working, thinking, creating, without worrying about appearances. Grace moved slowly, using the light from her phone to guide her. Every step stirred up dust that danced in the beam, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. She scanned the walls, the shelves, the floor, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, trying to find something, anything, that explained why Samuel had wanted her to choose this place. At first, nothing stood out. It was just a workshop. Old tools, worn surfaces, the remnants of years of use. There was no immediate sign of value, no obvious clue that this place held anything beyond what it appeared to be. The doubt returned, stronger this time, creeping into her thoughts, questioning whether she had misunderstood, whether she had placed too much weight on a moment that had been shaped by emotion rather than reason. Then she saw it. On one of the wooden support beams, carved carefully into the surface, was a small flower. Simple, almost childlike in its design, but unmistakable. She recognized it instantly. Samuel had drawn that same flower for her countless times over the years, on birthday cards, on scraps of paper, even once on her cast when she had broken her arm as a child. It wasn't random. It was intentional. She stepped closer, her fingers tracing the outline of the carving. The wood around it felt slightly different, smoother, as if it had been handled more recently than the rest of the structure. Her breath slowed as she focused, her mind shifting from doubt to attention, from uncertainty to possibility. She pressed against the beam. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible sound, something beneath her feet shifted. She froze, listening, her heart beginning to race as she looked down at the floor. What had seemed solid a moment ago now appeared slightly uneven. She knelt, running her hands along the boards until she found the edge of a panel that didn't quite align with the rest. It was subtle, designed to be overlooked, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. Carefully, she lifted it. Beneath it was a steel safe. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her mind struggling to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something forgotten or abandoned. This had been placed here deliberately, hidden in a way that required both trust and attention to uncover. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed away the dust covering the surface. The safe was old but well-maintained, its combination lock intact, waiting. She remembered Samuel's words. The combination is your birthday. It seemed simple enough, but as she began to turn the dial, she realized that even this required thought. She tried one format, then another, each attempt bringing a mix of anticipation and doubt. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had misunderstood, if the clue was more complicated than it seemed. Then she stopped. Samuel had always been consistent, always had his own way of doing things, his own logic that didn't always match what others expected. She adjusted the numbers, aligning them with the way he had always written dates, and turned the dial one final time. There was a click. The sound was small, almost quiet, but it carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire space. She hesitated for just a second, aware that whatever was inside would change everything, not just in terms of what she had chosen, but in terms of what that choice meant. Then she opened the safe. Inside was a metal box, neatly placed, its surface clean despite the dust around it. She lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight, and set it down on the floor in front of her. The label on the top caught her attention immediately, the words printed clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside were documents. Not random papers or old records, but organized files, each one stamped, signed, official in a way that immediately set them apart from anything else she had seen in the shed. She picked up the first one, her eyes scanning the text, trying to process what she was reading. It didn't make sense at first. Then it did. Her grandfather hadn't just built a life. He had built something far greater, something hidden, something that had been quietly growing for decades, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to be revealed to by the time the sun rose the next morning. The quiet isolation of the shed had already been replaced by something far more tense. Grace had barely slept, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to slow down. Every document she had read, every number she had seen, every line written in her grandfather's careful handwriting had reshaped her understanding of everything she thought she knew about him. The man they had all reduced to a fading memory had, in reality, been building something extraordinary in silence for decades. And now, that truth sat in her hands, waiting for the moment it would be revealed. She knew that moment was coming. Her phone, once dead, had come back to life after charging in her car, and with it came the flood of messages she had avoided the night before. Mockery had turned into confidence. Her family wasn't just laughing anymore. They were planning to tear down the shed, to erase it as if it had never mattered. They still believed it was worthless, still convinced that whatever she thought she had gained was nothing more than a mistake waiting to be corrected. Grace didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she made calls of her own. By early morning, the quiet dirt road leading to the shed was no longer empty. Black SUVs arrived one by one, parking at a distance that suggested intention rather than coincidence. Men stepped out, dressed in suits, their movements calm, deliberate, professional. They didn't approach the shed immediately. They observed, positioned themselves, prepared. Grace watched from the doorway, her expression steady, her posture composed. She didn't feel like the same person who had stood in that oak-paneled room the day before. Something had shifted, not just in her circumstances, but in her understanding of what those circumstances meant. At exactly 7:45 a.m., the sound of engines broke through the stillness. This time it wasn't quiet or controlled. It was loud, confident, almost celebratory. A flatbed truck carrying a bulldozer rolled into view, followed by a line of luxury cars that stood in sharp contrast to the modest surroundings. Richard's car was at the front, Caroline's close behind, the cousins following in a loose formation that felt less like an arrival and more like a performance. They stepped out one by one, dressed well, smiling, already holding glasses, already treating the moment like an event. There was laughter again, but this time it carried a different tone, anticipation, satisfaction, the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're about to prove something. Grace stepped outside. She didn't rush, didn't raise her voice, didn't try to stop them immediately. She simply stood there, her presence quiet but undeniable. For a brief moment, Richard didn't notice her. He was too busy speaking with the demolition crew, gesturing toward the shed, explaining what needed to be done. But when he finally turned and saw her, his expression shifted into something familiar, that same mixture of amusement and condescension. He walked toward her slowly, his steps deliberate, as if he were approaching someone who needed to be managed rather than confronted. Caroline followed, her expression softer but no less dismissive, her eyes scanning the shed as if confirming her belief that it held no value. The cousins gathered behind them, phones already out, recording, documenting, turning the moment into something shareable. To them, this wasn't just a demolition. It was proof. Proof that Grace had been wrong, that her choice had been foolish, that everything they believed about her had been justified. Richard spoke first, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He addressed the crew, giving them permission to begin, his tone confident, authoritative, unquestioned. But before the machinery could move, another voice cut through the moment. Calm, measured, certain. Everyone turned. From the line of black SUVs, a man stepped forward, followed by others who moved with the same quiet confidence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rush, didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Where there had been noise, there was now hesitation. Where there had been certainty, there was now confusion. He introduced himself clearly, his words precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. He handed Richard a document, his movements controlled, his expression unchanged. At first, Richard didn't react. He glanced at the paper, his expression dismissive, as if expecting it to be irrelevant. But as his eyes moved across the page, something changed. It wasn't immediate, but it was visible. The confidence in his posture weakened slightly, The certainty in his expression faltered. He looked up, ready to argue, ready to dismiss, but the words didn't come as easily as before. The explanation that followed was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. The shed wasn't part of the property he believed he owned. It belonged to Grace. Legally, completely, without question. Every assumption he had made, every claim he had voiced, every decision he had taken based on those beliefs, none of them held up against what was now being presented. The authority he had relied on was gone, replaced by something he couldn't control. Caroline stepped forward, her voice sharper now, her tone shifting from dismissal to frustration. She tried to reframe the situation, to bring it back into familiar territory, to treat it as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation rather than confrontation. But the response she received didn't match that approach. It was clear, final, unyielding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a boundary. Grace hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she had been, watching everything unfold, her expression calm, her presence steady. She didn't need to speak immediately. The moment was already changing, already shifting in a way that none of them had anticipated. The crew stepped back, uncertain, waiting for direction that no longer seemed valid. The cousins lowered their phones slightly, their confidence fading, their reaction slower, less certain. The energy that had fueled their arrival was beginning to unravel, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Then Grace spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. She didn't repeat what had already been said. She didn't argue or accuse. Instead, she did something far more disruptive. She revealed the truth. At first, it didn't land. The words were too far removed from what they expected, too disconnected from the narrative they had built in their minds. They tried to process it, to fit it into something familiar, but it didn't align. It couldn't. So she showed them. Not everything at once, but enough. Enough to shift the conversation from assumption to reality. The documents, the details, the explanation that followed, it all unfolded with a clarity that left no room for doubt. What they had dismissed as worthless was anything but. What they had laughed at was, in fact, the center of something far greater than anything they had received. The reactions came slowly. First confusion, then disbelief, then something deeper. Richard's posture changed. The certainty that had defined him just moments earlier was gone, replaced by something unsteady. He tried to respond, to question, to regain control of the situation, but the foundation he had been standing on had already collapsed. Caroline's expression shifted as well, the confidence in her demeanor replaced by something more fragile. She looked at Grace differently now, not as someone to be dismissed, but as someone she didn't fully understand. The cousins were silent. Their phones were no longer raised. The moment they had come to capture had transformed into something they didn't know how to process, something that couldn't be reduced to a joke or a post. Grace didn't rush. She let the silence settle, let the weight of the truth take its place, let them sit with the realization of what they had almost destroyed, what they had almost erased without ever understanding its value. The bulldozer remained still. The celebration had ended before it had even begun. And in its place stood something far more powerful, not just the revelation of wealth, but the undeniable proof that everything they had believed, everything they had assumed, everything they had mocked, had been wrong. In the hours and days that followed, Grace found herself standing at a crossroads that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with meaning. The truth had been revealed, the shock had settled, and the people who once mocked her now looked at her with a mixture of regret, disbelief, and something that resembled fear. But none of that defined what came next. What mattered was not what she had gained, but what she would choose to do with it. At first, everything felt distant, almost unreal. Meetings were arranged with attorneys, financial advisors, and people who spoke in numbers so large they barely felt connected to reality. They explained the structure of the trust, the ongoing flow of royalties, the stability of the patents, and the projections for the future. To them, it was all strategy, growth, and preservation. To Grace, it felt like noise surrounding something far more important. She spent most of her time back at the shed. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The space still carried the presence of her grandfather, not just in the tools he had left behind, but in the quiet, focused energy that seemed to fill the room. It reminded her of what truly mattered to him. He hadn't spent his life chasing attention or recognition. He had built something meaningful in silence, guided by purpose rather than pride. Sitting there, she began to understand that the money wasn't the legacy. It was the result. The real inheritance was the lesson he had built into every part of this experience, the test, the choice, the consequences. He hadn't just given her wealth. He had given her responsibility and, more importantly, the trust that she would handle it differently than the others. That realization changed everything. It would have been easy to walk away, to use the money to create a life of comfort and distance, to separate herself completely from the people who had hurt her. It would have been justifiable, even expected. But every time that thought surfaced, it felt wrong. Not because she didn't deserve peace, but because that wasn't what her grandfather had believed in. He hadn't built something extraordinary just to see it become another symbol of excess. He had built it to serve a purpose. So Grace started asking herself a different question. Not what can this money do for me, but what can I do with this money that actually matters? The answer didn't come all at once. It formed slowly, shaped by her experiences, her memories, and the values that had guided her long before she knew what was waiting in that shed. She thought about her work as a nurse, about the people she had cared for, about the struggles she had witnessed up close. She thought about the conversations she had shared with her grandfather, the way he spoke about creation, about helping others, about leaving something behind that extended beyond personal gain. That was when the idea took root. She didn't want to replace the shed. She wanted to transform it. Not into something flashy or grand, but into something meaningful. A place that reflected the same values her grandfather had lived by. A place where people could come not to be impressed, but to be supported. A place where opportunity wasn't tied to status, but to effort and need. The decision felt right in a way that nothing else had. Within days, she began putting it into motion. Not impulsively, but carefully, making sure that every step aligned with the purpose she had defined. The structure itself was restored, not erased. The exterior remained simple, preserving its history, its humility. But inside, everything changed. The space was reimagined into something functional, welcoming, and alive with possibility. She established a foundation, not as a gesture but as a commitment. It wasn't about charity in the traditional sense. It was about access, education, job training, counseling, resources that could genuinely change lives if given to the right people in the right way. She focused on areas that reflected both her own experience and her grandfather's work, creating opportunities for those who were willing to learn, to grow, to build something for themselves. The first group of people who came through the doors didn't see a wealthy benefactor. They saw someone who understood, someone who listened, someone who treated them with the same respect she had always valued. And that made all the difference. Word spread, not through headlines or announcements, but through stories. People talked about what they experienced there, about the help they received, about the way they were treated. Slowly, the space that had once been dismissed as worthless became something far more powerful than anyone had expected. It became a place of change. Meanwhile, her family watched. At first from a distance, unsure of how to approach her, unsure of where they stood. Their apologies came, some more sincere than others, but Grace didn't rush to respond. Forgiveness, she knew, wasn't something that could be demanded or performed. It had to be earned not through words but through actions. And over time, some of them began to understand that. They showed up not to reclaim what they had lost but to contribute in whatever way they could. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't immediate. But it was a start. The same people who had once measured everything by wealth were now being forced to confront a different standard, one that couldn't be bought or inherited. Grace didn't hold their past against them, but she didn't ignore it either. She allowed space for growth, but only if it was real. Because the lesson her grandfather had designed wasn't just for them. It was for her too. It reminded her that power, even when used with good intentions, had to be handled carefully. That influence could shape outcomes, but it could also distort them if not grounded in the right values. That staying true to who she was mattered more than anything she could gain or build. As the months passed, the impact of her decision became clearer. Lives changed. Opportunities opened. People who had once felt stuck began to move forward, not because they were given everything, but because they were given a chance. And in those moments, Grace felt something deeper than satisfaction. She felt alignment. The life she was living now, the choices she was making, the direction she was moving in, it all connected back to that single decision in the sitting room. The moment she chose trust over certainty, meaning over money, something unseen over something immediate. That choice had defined everything that followed. Looking back, she realized that her grandfather hadn't just tested her. He had prepared her. Prepared her to see beyond appearances, to value what others overlooked, to act with intention rather than impulse. He had given her more than wealth. He had given her clarity. And that clarity became her foundation. The world around her still saw the story in simple terms, a woman who chose a shed and gained a fortune. But the truth was far more complex, far more meaningful. She hadn't gained anything that day. She had revealed who she already was. And in doing so, she had proven that the greatest inheritance isn't measured in money, but in the ability to use what you have to create something that matters. Because at the end of everything, when the numbers fade and the headlines disappear, what remains isn't what you owned, but what you built, what you gave, and how you chose to live when no one was watching. Moral, true wealth is not what you receive, but how you use it. Because money can change your life, but character determines what you do with that change. Disclaimer. This story is created for entertainment and inspirational purposes. While it may be inspired by real-life themes and situations, characters, events, and details are fictionalized or dramatized to deliver a meaningful message about values, choices, and human behavior.